In the forgotten stretch of Appalachian hills, where pine trees whisper secrets older than memory, a young girl named Clara Mae trudged barefoot through the forest. She wasn't looking for adventure, only old scrap metal to trade for soup bones. And cough medicine. But fate doesn't knock on doors in places like these. It cries from the dirt. What she uncovered that afternoon, buried beneath a crumbling bed of moss and leaves, was no animal, no relic, but a man, gasping, half-mad, clawing, at life with fingernails cracked and bloodied. What Clara didn't know yet was that this man, Charles Whitmore, was presumed dead and very much wanted to stay that way. And what he whispered into her ear, shivering and half-delirious, would change her life forever. Not because it was terrifying, but because it was true. Before we continue, where are you watching from today? Comment below. The mountains kept their stories well. Old trails wound through thickets like veins through a hand, twisting, fading, barely remembered. And down near Miller's Hollow, in a shack tilted against time, lived Clara Mae Walker with her mother, Ruth. Clara had been born in that shack during a blizzard 12 years ago, in a storm that killed 3 cows and 1 local midwife. Folks said it was a bad omen. But Ruth, strong-willed and feverish with grief after her husband's passing just weeks prior, called it grace. "The Lord gave me Clara to keep me upright," she often whispered, even on the days when upright was a battle. Ruth hadn't walked in over a year. Rheumatoid arthritis had crept into her bones like cold into the walls, and now she sat most days in a rocking chair with a quilt across her knees, humming old hymns. It was Clara who kept the house fed and the fire lit. Most mornings, Clara rose before dawn, her chores simple in their hardness. Fetch water from the creek, check the trap lines, gather anything she could carry and sell, roots, mushrooms, discarded, cans or copper wiring if she got lucky. She didn't complain. Her life had never promised her ease. School was 3 miles down the road, past a rusted-out bridge and a grove of lightning-struck birches. Clara still went when she could, when the hunger wasn't too sharp or her mother too ill. Her teacher, Miss Eliza, called her bright beyond her years. But Clara never thought much about years, only days, and each day had to be endured. Meanwhile, the rest of the world spun in its own orbit. Not 10 miles away, in the estate once known as Stone Hollow, lived, or had lived, Charles Whitmore. Charles was the kind of man small towns loved to hate. He was rich, yes, money passed down from railroads and land sales, but he was also quiet, aloof, and peculiar. He rarely left the mansion, except to walk in the woods behind it. Those woods spanned hundreds of acres, and Charles often wandered there alone for hours, sometimes days. Some said he'd gone soft in the head after his wife died. Others whispered darker things, that he saw shadows that weren't there, spoke to the wind. But no one ever said it to his face. Because Charles paid his taxes on time, donated to the church, and gave scholarships to local students, even if he never came to graduation. And then, one afternoon in early spring, Charles vanished. At first, it stirred only passing curiosity. Maybe he'd taken another of his long hikes. But by the 3rd day, his housekeeper called the sheriff. A search party was formed, volunteers, dogs, even a helicopter from the next county. They found nothing. His family, those who'd circled like vultures since his heart attack 2 years ago, flew in immediately. There was his sister Evelyn, tall and bitter, who'd married into a failing plastics business. His nephews, Jeremy and Richard, both clean-shaven and shifty-eyed. They stood on the porch during the televised appeal, solemn-faced, asking the public for prayers, but anyone who knew them saw what lay beneath the words. Charles had never married again, never had children, and never rewritten his will. Evelyn. And the boys stood to inherit everything. Within a week, the estate was under legal hold. By week 2, talk of Charles turned to past tense. "It's a shame," folks said. "He weren't a bad man, just odd. But Charles wasn't dead. Not yet." And deep in the woods beyond Miller's Hollow, under a thin blanket of pine needles and rotting leaves, he was trying to scream. It was on a Thursday that Clara heard it. She'd been following a squirrel trail, searching for ginseng root. The old furrows near the ridge were known for it, though poachers had picked the easy spots. Clean. She crouched low, poking with a stick when she heard it. Not a voice, not at first, but a thud. Faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat underfoot. She froze. No birds, no wind, just that soft, insistent sound. And then, unmistakably, a moan. Clara bolted, upright, heart hammering. It came again, closer now. Her mind raced. Injured animal? A person? She crept forward, eyes scanning the brush until she saw it. An unnatural rise in the soil. Loose, disturbed earth, like something had been buried. In haste, panic surged in her throat. She should run, get help. But the moan came again, cracked and broken. "Hello?" she called. No answer. She dropped to her knees, clawing at the dirt. It took nearly 15 minutes to reach him. Her fingers bled from roots and rocks. Her breath came in sobs, but finally, she uncovered a face, pale, sunken, smeared with soil. Eyes swollen shut, lips trembling. His first word was a whisper. Don't tell them." Clara sat back, stunned. "Don't tell who?" she whispered. "Family," he rasped. "Please, water." She didn't ask his name. Something in her, deep primal, already knew. Charles Whitmore. She ran back to the shack, grabbed her canteen and 2 stale biscuits, and returned in under an hour. He drank so greedily she feared he'd choke. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the fire while her mother dozed in the rocker, hands shaking. Who would do such a thing, and why? She thought about the nephews, their cold smiles, the way they'd looked at the cameras. There was something wrong in all of it. At dawn, Clara wrapped a blanket and some boiled potatoes in her satchel. She told her mother she was going to the ridge for elderberries. Then she slipped into the trees. Back at the burial site, Charles had dragged himself a few feet toward a log. His face was clearer now, haunted, sunken, and streaked with tears. "You shouldn't have helped me," he murmured. Clara set down the food. "Why not? They'll come for you too." And in that moment, Clara Mae Walker understood something, terrible and beautiful. The woods weren't empty. They were watching. Before Charles Whitmore ever met the earth with his face pressed to soil and lungs gasping for breath, his life had already become a quiet battleground. Stone Hollow wasn't just a mansion. It was a fortress of legacy, built by blood, steel, and compromise. Charles's grandfather, Everett Whitmore, had carved the estate into the hills during the tail end of the railroad boom. The house stood 3 stories tall, its stones quarried locally, its iron railings hand-forged by men who had long since passed into forgotten graves. Charles grew up in that house, the youngest of 3 children, but the only one who returned after war, after college, after death came, and carried their parents away. Evelyn, his older sister, had married quickly and poorly. Her husband, Calvin, once promised invention, but delivered only lawsuits. Jeremy and Richard, their sons, grew up in stone halls filled with scorn, the kind that sticks like tar and becomes ambition only when sharpened by jealousy. Charles, meanwhile, remained unmarried. Rumors followed him, lovers lost, secrets kept, a heart broken by a woman who chose city lights over Appalachian fog. But he never spoke of any of it. Instead, he poured his energy into preserving the land, donating to local schools, funding land conservancies, and repairing one forgotten cemetery after another. He walks with ghosts, the town said. But at least he walks alone. And so he did, until his heart failed him. 2 years before the woods swallowed him, Charles collapsed in his study. The maid found him face down on blueprints for a greenhouse he never got to build. The hospital saved him, but the whispers began. Evelyn came down from Pittsburgh with her lawyer in tow, asking quiet questions. Charles fired her lawyer the next day and replaced his own with a firm from Charleston. It was a clear message. He wasn't ready to go. But ready or not, Charles had begun preparing. He revised his will, met with notaries, made calls to distant cousins, none of whom bore Evelyn's last name. He even wrote a sealed letter to be opened in case of death, its contents known only to him and the attorney who stored it. The letter never made it to the courthouse. Weeks before his disappearance, the family returned under the pretense of visiting. Richard claimed he wanted to learn the family business. Jeremy wandered the property with a metal detector, saying he was just looking for coins. Evelyn cooked a roast and asked about antique jewelry. Charles endured it all with silence. Until he didn't. The housekeeper, Gloria, later testified that on March 9th, Charles shouted during dinner. "You're not entitled to what you didn't build," he said. He stood, chest heaving, and left the table. It was the last time she saw him alive. The next morning, he left for a walk in the woods. His cane, jacket, and journal went with him. By sunset, when he hadn't returned, she called the sheriff, and just like that, Stone Hollow changed hands. The estate passed into legal limbo. The family, armed with pending probate documents and teary interviews, slipped into power with chilling ease. They hired contractors to secure the premises and accountants to review expenses. One local boy was fired for asking too many questions. A painter never got paid. A neighbor's land dispute suddenly ruled in Evelyn's favor. But the forest didn't forget, and neither did Clara Mae. While Charles's past was layered with cold wariness, Clara's life unfolded with a kind of brutal honesty. There was no room for pretense in her world. No hiding behind velvet curtains or silver pens. Her daddy, Samuel Walker, had been a man of hands and hope, a mechanic by trade, a hunter by necessity. He fixed farm equipment for neighbors and taught Clara to track a deer from a single broken twig. "Always listen to the land," he'd said. "It don't lie." He died when Clara was 4. An axle gave out while he was under a tractor. Ruth never forgave the machine, or God. For years, she wore her grief like an apron, tied tight and soaked through. Clara never saw her mother cry. Not once. The sickness came slowly, first in her wrists, then her knees, until even walking became a pain she bore silently, but her voice never wavered. When Clara asked if she was dying, Ruth would reply, "We all are, but I ain't planning to finish early." Despite her hardship, Ruth taught Clara one sacred rule. We help when we can, not because we get something, but because we're here. That rule echoed in Clara's head the day she found Charles, not just when she pulled him from the earth, but when she fed him, wiped his brow, and prayed softly beside him that first night. She didn't think about reward. She didn't think about danger. She thought only, he's alive. Each morning after that, she walked deeper into the woods, bringing what food she could carry, a half-loaf of cornbread, a thermos of weak broth. Once, half a bottle of aspirin. Charles never asked her to stay, but when she did, his eyes softened, and slowly he began to speak. He told her about the house, the land, his walks, about the fight at dinner, about how he'd woken in the dark, bound and gagged, in the back of a truck. "They thought I'd die quick," he said. "They didn't bury me deep, just enough to keep the wolves off, I guess." Clara shivered. "Why?" "They wanted the money, and they were tired of waiting." She didn't respond. What words could she offer? Instead, she read to him. Psalms from a pocket Bible. One day she brought him her spelling homework and asked if he wanted to hear it. He said yes. She noticed the change in him. At first, his voice was dry and cracked, but slowly it grew clearer. His hands stopped shaking. The color returned to his cheeks, but his eyes, they held something broken like a window that couldn't be unshattered. One day he asked about her father. She told him. He nodded slowly. "You know what it's like then," he said, "to lose everything in a breath." She nodded back. They never spoke of it again. By the second week, Clara realized she couldn't keep him hidden forever. Supplies were running low. Her mother needed more medicine. And Charles needed real care, more than she could offer. She tried to ask Miss Eliza at school what to do, hypothetically. Her teacher's brow furrowed. If someone's in danger, even if you're scared, you go to someone you trust. But Clara didn't trust the sheriff, or the judge, or the whispering mouths in town. That night, Charles grabbed her wrist gently. "If I disappear again," he said, "don't come looking." "I won't let them," she whispered. He smiled, faint and tired. "You're too good, Clara Mae. That's the trouble." And then he leaned close. His voice was barely sound. He whispered something into her ear. Something she couldn't understand then. Words that sounded like a riddle, or a warning. Her eyes welled with tears. She nodded without knowing why. It was the first time in years she cried in front of anyone. She never repeated the words. Not until much, much later. The wind shifted that morning. Not with force, but with a subtle unease. Like the woods themselves were trying to speak in a voice no one had time to hear. Clara Mae felt it in her chest before she noticed anything with her eyes. The pine needles whispered differently underfoot. Even the crows stayed silent. She'd packed more food than usual. Her mother had fallen into a deeper cough the night before, and Clara had stewed chicken broth from a bony carcass she'd bartered for. Bones for berries, berries for aspirin, aspirin for silence. She wrapped the thermos tight in a wool scarf and made the long hike to the spot near the ridge where Charles lay hidden. When she arrived, the clearing was empty. At first, she thought she had the wrong place. The leaves were too still, the log overturned. But then she saw the mark, 3 slashes on the tree bark where she'd scratched an M for memory. She scanned the brush, her heart thumping a ragged rhythm, and then she heard it, a low, broken wheeze. She followed the sound to the hollow beneath the cedar, and there he was, Charles, curled tight, like a child hiding from a storm. His breathing was shallow. His hands clutched his side. "I thought maybe you'd stopped coming," he rasped. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, unscrewing the thermos and holding it to his lips. "You moved," she said gently. "Couldn't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear them." "Who?" Charles stared past her, eyes locked on something only he could see. "Jeremy, Richard." They laughed, said no one would look for me, said they'd make it look like I drowned in the river. He paused, a tremor running through his jaw. "But they buried me, like garbage." Clara bit her tongue to silence the surge of questions. Instead, she reached for a cloth and began wiping his brow. "They won't find you, not here." He gave her a weary smile. "You're not just a girl, you're something else entirely, but..." Clara didn't feel like anything special. She felt scared. Each visit had become more dangerous. Word had spread through the hollow that Charles's family was selling off bits of the estate, furniture, livestock, even the greenhouse before. It was finished. Evelyn had appeared at the post office mailing urgent legal notices, and Jeremy had been seen driving around back roads in a dark sedan. Clara had seen the car parked not far from where she gathered herbs. They were watching, and watching. Meant someone was suspicious. That evening, Clara stayed longer. She brought one of her father's old hunting knives and left it with Charles, not because he could use it, but because the gesture steadied them both. "If anything happens," she said, "you blow this whistle." She handed him the rusted tin whistle from her satchel, once her father's, now hers. He nodded, and then he asked a question she hadn't prepared for. "Clara, why are you helping me?" She didn't speak at first. Her fingers plucked at the edge of her sleeve. "Because I don't believe people should be left in the dark to die," she said at last. "And because my mama always said, when someone falls, you reach out your hand, even if the whole world tells you to walk away." Charles closed his eyes. "Then your mama raised a better person than most of the world." That night, as Clara returned home beneath the lowering sky, her boots soaked through from a marshy shortcut, she noticed a figure on the porch, a man, tall, wearing a pressed coat and leather gloves. He turned as she stepped into view. "Clara Mae Walker?" he asked, her body tensed. "Yes, sir." He smiled too easily. "Name's Mr. Redfield. I'm with a private search firm. Charles Whitmore's family hired us to look into his disappearance. We're canvassing the area. Thought maybe you saw something on your walks." Clara forced herself to breathe. "No, sir," she said quietly. "I don't go that far." "Well, some folks say you're always in those woods, hunting roots. That true?" She shrugged. "Sometimes, but I stick to the creeks. Mama's sick, I can't be gone long." He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Well, if you do remember anything, even something small, you be sure to tell your mama and have her call us." He handed her a card, white, thick, and too clean for the hollow. She nodded and went inside. That night, she burned the card in the stove. The next morning, she skipped school. She left at dawn and ran nearly the whole way to the clearing. Charles was awake, sitting up against a log, the knife she'd given him balanced across his lap. His face was pale, but alert. "They've been asking around," Clara said breathlessly. "They came to my house." Charles didn't move. "Who?" "A man in a coat. Said he was looking for you. Said your family hired him." Charles's jaw clenched. "Redfield," he muttered. "He used to be my father's estate enforcer. Fired him after the coal theft trial. Of course Evelyn brought him back." "What do we do?" Clara asked. Charles didn't answer. Instead, he reached into a pouch at his side and handed her something, a key. "I need you to go to the north side of Stone Hollow. There's a shed behind the old stables. This key opens it. Inside is a ledger. Red cover, gold binding. Get it." Clara's eyes widened. "Why?" "Because it proves what they did. It has records. Altered withdrawals, forged signatures. If something happens to me again, that book tells the truth." Clara swallowed hard. This wasn't just helping a hurt man anymore. This was bigger. This was danger that wore human clothes and smiled with too many teeth. But she nodded. "I'll go. Tonight." That night, Clara waited until her mother slept, her breathing thick and rattling. She placed a damp cloth on Ruth's forehead, kissed her cheek, and stepped out into the cold. She moved like mist, silent, quick, knowing every root and stone by heart. It took her 2 hours to reach the edge of the Whitmore estate. The once proud fences now sagged. The great stables stood like hollow bones under the moonlight. She crept to the back, found the shed, slid the key into the rusted lock. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and old smoke. Cobwebs curled around the beams, and in a corner beneath a folded tarp was the ledger. Red, gold-spined, thick with secrets. She grabbed it, wrapped it in her coat, and ran. But someone had been watching. Halfway back down the trail, a light flickered. In the woods, a lantern. Clara dropped behind a log, holding her breath. Voices drifted. 2 men, one younger, one older. Said she comes this way every few days. "You sure it's her?" "Girl fits the description. Dirty boots, dark hair, lean frame. She knows something. I don't like this. We bury one mistake, now we're chasing a kid." Orders from the top. If she knows where he is, she's a loose thread. Clara closed her eyes. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She waited. Minutes passed, the voices faded. She didn't move until the sun rose, and when she did, she clutched the ledger like it was life itself. She reached the clearing by noon. Charles was asleep, his face slack with exhaustion. She shook him gently. "Wake up." His eyes opened slowly. "I have it," she whispered. He blinked. Then for the first time he smiled, fully, deeply. But it didn't last, because at that moment, a crow cried out in the trees, and from the ridge above, something glittered, a scope. A rifle? No, just binoculars, watching. Clara pulled Charles backward, under the log, her breath coming fast. "We don't have much time," she said, and for the first time, Charles looked truly afraid. Not for himself, for her. For 3 nights, Clara didn't sleep. She lay beside her mother, eyes open, breath shallow, her mind turning over and over like a stone tumbling in dark water. Every sound outside, the groan of the wind, the snap of a twig, made her flinch. She'd hidden the ledger beneath a loose floorboard, wrapping it in her father's old denim work shirt. Even touching it made her skin prickle, like it pulsed. With danger. At school, she kept her head down. Miss Eliza noticed. "You look pale as paper, Clara Mae. You feeling all right?" Clara nodded. "Just tired," she murmured. But tired wasn't the word. It was heavier than that. It was the kind of weariness that didn't just live in the body, it lived in the soul. The fear had settled in deep now. Not just fear of being followed, but fear of what it meant, to carry the truth of what they'd done to Charles. Fear that the moment she stepped wrong, she'd vanish too. That someone would bury her under pine needles and hush her away forever. Meanwhile, Charles grew weaker, not physically. His wounds had begun to heal, his appetite slowly returned, but something inside him had shifted. A hollowness had crept behind his eyes. Sometimes he stared into the trees so long she'd have to touch his arm to bring him back. "You think too much," Clara said quietly one day, offering him a boiled egg she'd saved from the church pantry. "You sit in your head too long." He looked at her, surprised. "What else is there to do?" buried in silence. She didn't answer, just chewed slowly and watched him. That afternoon it rained, cold late spring rain that pounded the roof of the hunting shack in a rhythmic taps. Charles sat wrapped in an old wool blanket, his legs trembling beneath layers. Clara lit a fire, the smoke curling up through a broken beam above. After a long silence, he spoke. "When I was 15, he said, my brother fell through the ice on Tanner's Creek. We'd been told not to go, Mama warned us, but we were boys, arrogant, stupid. He slipped through, screamed once, then the water swallowed him. I ran for help, but it was too late." Clara said nothing, just listened. They never forgave me. My mother barely looked at me again after that. My father turned quiet, hard. He never hit me, but he made sure I understood what I'd taken from him. I spent the next 10 years trying to become something they could love. And did they? Clara asked. Charles looked away. "I don't know. By the time I had anything worth being proud of, they were both gone. The fire cracked between them. I think," he started again, "I think when you carry that kind of guilt, you don't live anymore. You haunt yourself." Clara met his eyes. "You're not dead yet." He looked at her, truly looked, and nodded once. The rain poured harder. Outside, the creek swelled. Clara knew she'd be late getting home. Her mother would worry. But still she sat there, curled on the floor beside the fire, because something in Charles's voice told her he needed her silence more than he needed solitude. That night, she returned home soaked to the skin. Her mother, feverish, was sitting up with a rag pressed to her chest. "Where were you?" Ruth asked, her voice rasped thin from coughing. Clara didn't lie. "In the woods." Ruth nodded. "I know. You carry your father's look when you're hiding something." "I'm not hiding," Clara said. Ruth studied her for a long moment. "You helping someone?" Clara's breath caught. "Why would you say that?" "Because you've been walking like your shoes are filled with secrets," her mother said softly. "And because helping's the only thing that ever made our blood run warm." Clara said nothing. But her mother didn't press further. She only reached out and placed her hand over Clara's. "I hope you're doing it for the right reasons." That night, Clara couldn't stop thinking about the ledger, about the names inside it, the transfers, the dates, the betrayals documented in bloodless handwriting. She thought about the kind of man who didn't just steal, but buried someone alive to keep the money. And then she thought about what Charles had whispered that night, the words that made her cry without knowing why. "I saw your father's name in their files." At first she hadn't understood. Her father, Samuel Walker, had died years ago. He wasn't part of any scheme. He wasn't rich or powerful or threatening. But Charles had seen something in Evelyn's papers, a document about false labor charges from 10 years back, tied to a logging company that folded after her husband skimmed from its pension fund. Samuel had worked for that Company. He'd been laid off 3 weeks before his accident. They'd lost their savings. He was under that tractor because he was fixing it for trade, not pay. Clara's world tilted. The darkness wasn't new. It had always been there. Her family had been collateral damage in someone else's rise to power. They hadn't just been poor by fate. They'd been emptied out, drop by drop, by the same greedy hands now sipping tea on Charles's balcony. And that broke something in her. The next morning, she didn't go to school. She returned to the shack and handed Charles a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "My father's last ledger," she said. "My mama kept it. Every payment he was owed. Every job canceled. He wrote it all down before he died." Charles opened it carefully, his brow furrowed. "These company names," he whispered. These match Evelyn's fake accounts." Clara nodded. "I know." He looked at her with something like awe. "You're not just helping me anymore. I'm helping my father," she said, "and my mama, and every family who got stripped bare so they could build a marble kitchen and smile at funerals." Charles exhaled slowly. "I always thought justice came in courtrooms," he said. "It comes in girls with calloused hands, too," Clara said. That day, they began to plan. Not just survival, but revelation. Clara wrote a letter to a man named Silas Greer, a former journalist who'd once exposed corruption in a coal company Charles helped dismantle years ago. He was retired now, but still lived in a cabin 2 counties over. Charles dictated the words. Clara wrote them in careful cursive, sealing the envelope with wax melted over the fire. They entrusted it to an old woman in town, Miss June, who owed Ruth a long-standing favor. She sent it through her church correspondence circle, disguised among recipe swaps and prayer chains. And then, they waited. For 6 days, no answer. On the 7th, a reply came. Scrawled on the back of an old receipt were 3 words, "I'm on my way." The relief that flooded Clara's chest nearly made her weep. But Charles didn't relax. He stood that evening by the fire, staring into the flames, rubbing his wrist where a scar still formed. "You should be far away from this," he said. "I shouldn't have let you in." Clara shook her head. "You didn't let me in. I broke in." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid," he said after a pause. "Of them? Of what I'll be when it's over." She tilted her head. "I've spent so long being angry. Then I spent longer being afraid. I don't know what's left when that's gone." Clara stepped closer, her voice calm and clear. "Maybe you just be grateful." He looked at her. "For what?" "For still being here. For not letting them decide your last breath." And with that, she picked up her satchel, adjusted her scarf, and headed for the door. But just before she stepped out into the dusk, Charles spoke again. "Clara?" She turned. "You saved me from the ground," he said, "but it's your faith that's pulled me back to the light." She didn't smile. She only nodded, because she understood what it meant to drag someone out of the dark, not just with hands, but with hope. And as the sky dimmed, and the woods bristled with secrets not yet told, Clara Mae Walker walked home with the weight of history in her bag and the whisper of justice on her breath. The dogwoods began to bloom, pale blossoms unfurled like soft stars through the brush, dappling the edges of the holler in shades of white and pink. To most, it would be a passing season, no more significant than a breeze. But to Clara Mae Walker, it felt like a sign. Life was stirring again, even among roots tangled with secrets. The letter from Silas Greer had ignited something in Charles. He moved differently now, not quickly, not confidently, but with purpose. Each day he'd sit upright a little longer, eat a little more, speak with a little less hesitation. The paralysis of fear had begun to lift. Clara noticed the change in herself, too. Where once there had been only dread, now there was focus. She wasn't walking in shadows anymore. She was walking toward something, and yet, they both knew it, was only the eye of the storm. Silas had written again. This time, he included a burner number and instructions to meet on the edge of Copper Ridge Trail. No paper, no calls. He would come alone. The stakes were too high for anything else. I don't trust easily, the letter had said. But I trust you, Charles. If what you've sent is real, you're about to light a fuse they thought they buried with you. Clara read the words aloud by lamplight as Charles stared at the fire, his fingers pressed against the red ledger, like it was a heartbeat. When she finished, silence hung between them like smoke. Then he said softly, "They won't let this go without a fight." She nodded. "But we're not fighting alone anymore." 2 days before the meeting, Clara did something she hadn't done in weeks. She spent the morning with her mother. They boiled sassafras for tea. Ruth braided Clara's hair, slowly, her swollen hands trembling only a little. "You've changed," Ruth said, eyes narrowed, but not in judgment. Clara blinked. "How so?" "You move different, like a girl who knows what fire feels like and still steps into it." Clara didn't answer. Ruth leaned in, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't know what you're caught up in, baby, but I know you're carrying more than your size, and that's never been fair." Clara swallowed. "I'm doing what's right." "I know you are. That's what scares me most." They didn't speak again for a while, but that night, Ruth folded a piece of paper and placed it into Clara's palm. "Your daddy wrote this when the plant shut down. I found it tucked in his Bible. I didn't want to read it then, but I do now." Clara opened the page. The handwriting was jagged, but still strong. "If we lose the little we still have truth. If they take even that, we are no longer people. They've made us shadows. But I won't live as a shadow. Not while my daughter has a name and my wife has a voice." Clara read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it beside Charles's ledger in her satchel. They were going to meet Silas the next day. She packed with purpose: water, bandages, a map, and the letter. Charles tucked the ledger into a hollowed-out Bible cover. "Looks like a sermon book," he said. "No one suspects a sermon in a town this crooked." They left before dawn. The trail to Copper Ridge was longer than she remembered. 4 miles through switchbacks, brambles, and sudden drops. Charles walked slowly, leaning on Clara's shoulder more than his cane. She never rushed him. Every step forward was another defiance of the grave he had been left in. By mid-morning, they reached the overlook, and Silas was there, lean, silver-haired, in a windbreaker and worn boots. He didn't wave, just watched them climb the last hill with a face carved from suspicion and memory. When they reached him, Clara stepped aside. Charles held out the book. Silas took it and opened to a marked page. He read in silence for 5 minutes. Then he sat down on a rock and sighed. "Well, damn," he muttered. "You really weren't paranoid." "I thought I was," Charles said. Silas nodded. "That's how they win. Make you question your own eyes. But this is bigger than I thought." He looked at Clara. "You found him?" She nodded. "And you're what, 12? She nodded again. He exhaled slowly. "Well, I suppose I owe my faith to a child now." "She's more than a child," Charles said. "She's the reason I'm still breathing." Silas didn't argue. Instead, he flipped through the ledger, taking notes in a worn pocket journal. "This ties the land fraud, the company embezzlement, and the staged disappearance into one thread. They've been laundering assets under Evelyn's husband's shell companies for years. You were going to rewrite your will. They panicked." "I thought they'd wait until I passed," Charles said quietly. "They couldn't afford the wait," Silas replied. "Debt collectors started closing in. They needed it now, and you were inconveniently alive." Silas looked at Clara again. "I don't know what they'll do when this breaks, but I know what they've already tried. You need to keep her safe." Charles nodded. "She stays with me." Silas handed him a flash drive. "I've scanned your ledger. I'll bring it to a federal contact I still trust. This isn't a county court matter anymore. It's interstate crime, but don't expect justice to come quickly." "I've waited this long," Charles said. "I can wait a bow." "Little longer?" They shook hands. Silas placed a hand on Clara's shoulder before leaving. "You did more than save a life," he said. "You resurrected a man." She didn't answer, but she held his gaze with the strength of someone twice her age. As he disappeared down the trail, Charles sat heavily on the rock beside her. "I feel like I've just handed off my last heartbeat," he murmured. "It wasn't your last," Clara replied. "It was your first clean one." They stayed on the ridge until the sun started to drop. Then they made the slow walk back, pausing at the creek to drink, listening to the frogs singing dusk into being. That night, back in the hunting shack, Clara made stew from onions, potatoes, and a tin of chicken. It was a meager meal, but it warmed their stomachs and calmed their nerves. Afterward, Charles pulled out a harmonica from his coat. "I haven't touched this in 20 years, he said. Clara smiled. "Play it." He did, softly, clumsily at first. But the notes came, together like pieces of a memory rediscovered, a hymn, broken and beautiful. She listened with her eyes closed, and for a few precious minutes, the world held its breath. There was no chase, no threat, no death looming, just two souls by firelight, bound not by blood or obligation, but by a deeper truth. That kindness is rebellion in a cruel world, and survival is sometimes the loudest form of justice. The next morning, Clara awoke before sunrise. Charles was still asleep, one hand resting gently on the Bible cover. She stood, stretched, and stepped outside. The mist hugged the trees. The light was gold. She felt something lift inside her. Not peace. Not yet. But hope. The kind that doesn't come from promises or plans, but from knowing you did something good in a world that too often forgets what that means. Before we continue, have you ever had to do something brave when you were still? Just a child? Something no one else knew you did, but you remember it every day? Share your story in the comments below. Clara's strength might remind someone of your own. It began with silence, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from the air pulling back before the lightning strikes. 3 days passed after the meeting with Silas. Charles remained in the cabin, resting, waiting, watching the shadows stretch longer each night. Clara, ever vigilant, continued her daily treks, gathering supplies, checking traps, and listening in town. But something had shifted in Miller's Hollow. The smiles were tighter, the questions were bolder, and the car came back. The same dark sedan she'd seen once before, now parked more brazenly near the general store. Inside sat a man in mirrored sunglasses, sipping coffee from a thermos. He watched everyone, and Clara felt the chill of recognition crawl up her spine. Redfield. She knew his name from Charles's lips, but she also knew his type without needing it. Men like him didn't protect. They enforced. Not laws, but loyalties. And he wasn't the only one. Jeremy and Richard had returned too, this time without the sorrowful eyes and buttoned-up coats. They laughed too loud at the gas station, flashed money in a place that hadn't seen a paycheck in weeks. They didn't ask if Charles had been found. They acted like he never existed, and that was more terrifying than if they'd gone door to door with questions. They weren't looking because they believed he was already gone. One evening, Clara saw Redfield speaking with Mr. Garner, the old postal clerk. They stood close, too close. When Redfield passed her on the porch, he tipped his hat and said, "You Walker girls still keep to the woods, don't you?" She forced herself to nod, smiling just enough. But inside, her gut twisted. She ran the whole way home, bursting through the door to find her mother at the stove, her frame smaller than ever in the growing twilight. "We have to leave soon," Clara whispered. Ruth turned. "Why?" "They're circling now." Ruth didn't ask who. She only looked at her daughter for a long time, then said, "We'll go when you say." That night, Clara returned to Charles with urgency burning behind her ribs. "They know something," she said. "Redfield's back. Jeremy and Richard, too." Charles didn't look surprised, only tired. "They never planned to vanish quietly," he said. "If Silas makes this public, they'll try to crush the story before it walks." Clara sat beside him, knees folded under her. "So we move?" Charles shook his head. "We hold, just a little longer. Silas said the report would reach federal hands by Friday. After that, It's not just our fight. Clara nodded. But deep, inside, she knew the truth. The fight was already here. The next morning, a knock rattled the shack door. Charles tensed. Clara grabbed her father's old knife and crept to the window. It was Miss June, the same woman who had mailed their first letter to Silas. Clara opened the door slowly. Come in. Miss June entered, her hands shaking as she pulled off her coat. I overheard something at the post office, she said. Redfield's intercepted the church mail route. He's looking at return addresses. He suspects someone leaked documents. He said they'll shut it down quietly. Clara's breath caught. What does that mean? Miss June's eyes watered. It means whatever you're doing, you've got hours, not days. Charles stood slowly. Then we leave tonight, Miss... June nodded. I'll draw them off. Say I'm headed to Charleston for a funeral. They'll follow me. They're watching your place, Clara. Clara blinked. My mother... I'll send her with Pastor Elkins, Miss June said. He's taking a truckload of wood to the next county. Quiet man, loyal. Charles put a hand on Clara's shoulder. You've done more than enough. Let us carry you now. But Clara shook her head. No, we finish this. That night, the cabin was packed in silence. Ruth left with the pastor just before midnight, wrapped in a quilt, her lips pressed to Clara's forehead. Find me again when the leaves change, she whispered. I'll be waiting. Clara nodded, and then they were gone. Clara and Charles took to the woods. Not toward the main road, but into the belly of the forest, through deer paths and forgotten hollows only Samuel Walker had once known. They made it halfway before the dogs began to bark. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. They've loosed a trail, Charles said. Let them follow, Clara replied. We're not heading where they think, and they weren't. They were heading toward the old ranger's post, a boarded-up lookout station from the 1940s, perched high above the gorge. Silas had arranged for it to be reopened, for one night only. It was there they'd make the call, the final call. They reached it at dawn. Inside waited Silas, pale from fatigue, his radio crackling. I've got them, he said. FBI's en route, but we need proof of life. Charles stepped forward. Silas recorded him, his face, his voice, the ledger in hand. I, Charles Everett Whitmore, was buried alive by my family in a planned attempt to seize my estate and erase my existence. These are the documents. This is the witness. This is the child who saved me. Then he looked at Clara. She saved more than me. She saved the truth. The recording ended. Silas transferred it to 3 drives. Now we run, he said. They'll know by sunrise. And they did. Because just as they exited the station, 3 black SUVs emerged from the trees. No sirens. No shouting, just headlights. Cold and slow. Silas pulled Clara back. Go out the back. Charles refused. They'll never stop until I face them, he said. This ends now. Clara's eyes welled. You'll die. No, he said. I've already done that. Now I live. He stepped forward, arms raised. Redfield got out first, then Jeremy, then Richard, all smug. All dressed like mourning. You gave us a scare, Uncle, Richard said. Jeremy grinned. You look, well, considering. Redfield stepped forward. You're making a mistake. Charles lifted the ledger. You made it first. Behind him, a voice rang out. FBI, hands in the air. From the ridge, agents emerged, silent, swift, precise. Within seconds, it was over. The nephews in cuffs. Redfield restrained, Charles, upright, and Clara. Shaking, but not from fear, from release. Later, as agents interviewed them in the cabin, one turned to Clara. How did you find him? She looked at Charles, then at the woods. I heard the earth crying. The agent frowned. I'm sorry, she smiled faintly. I listened. That's all. I listened when no one else did. Outside, the sun rose higher, and the air, at last, smelled clean. The news broke like thunder on dry ground. Within 24 hours of the arrests, every local station across 3 states led with the same story. Appalachian heiress arrested in alleged plot to bury brother alive for inheritance. National outlets picked it up by sundown. The headlines grew longer, uglier, more breathless with each new hour. Greed, bloodlines, and buried secrets in West Virginia estate scandal. They showed the mugshots of Jeremy and Richard, their faces empty of remorse. Evelyn, too, though her photo was older, taken from a fundraiser where she'd once posed beside a congressman. Her lips wore a careful smile in the image, but her eyes looked past the camera, cold and untouched, and then, without warning, came the photograph no one expected. It wasn't Charles, it was Clara, a single blurry photo of a thin girl, walking. Through the trees and tattered boots, her back to the camera, a red satchel slung over her shoulder. The caption called her an unidentified juvenile. But not for long. Her name slipped out through court records tied to the federal testimony. It was only a matter of time. Clara Mae Walker. 12 years old. No legal guardian, no official statement. Maid. The press descended like ravens to a carcass. They camped outside Stone Hollow. They knocked on doors in Miller's Hollow. They tracked down Miss Eliza, who stood on her porch in a yellow sweater and said simply, "That girl has more moral, strength in her little finger than most men do in their whole life." Miss June refused comment. Pastor Elkins wouldn't speak a word either. But still, the noise grew louder, and in the center of it all, Clara and Charles stayed hidden. For 3 days, they remained in a safe house arranged by Silas, an old church parsonage turned refuge on the edge of Tucker County. It smelled of cedar and mothballs, and the windows were covered with old quilts to block view and light. The FBI advised silence. "Don't give statements. Don't show your faces. The story is already louder than the truth. No need to shout into it." But Charles, ever the man who watched more than he spoke, knew better. "They'll turn her into a symbol," he said one night, pacing slowly near the fireplace. "The brave girl from the woods, the orphan who saved a millionaire, the child hero with hollowed eyes, and they'll forget she's real." "She is real," Silas said, setting down a pot of coffee. "But the world won't understand that. If you lock her away." Charles sat down, fingers pressed to his temple. "I'm not asking for fame," Clara said from the couch, voice small. "But people need to know what they did. Not just to you, to my father, to the others. They've been stealing for decades. What if it doesn't end here?" Silas looked at her, then nodded slowly. "There's a reporter," he said. "Trustworthy. Name's Ellie Crane. Works for a national outlet, but she's local. Grew up on a farm. Doesn't trade in gossip. If we talk to her." The decision was made. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The safe house was quiet, but her mind was loud, flooded with memories, echoes, unfinished thoughts. She crept out of bed and into the hallway. Charles was awake too, sitting by a window, looking out at nothing. "I don't know what comes next," she said. He didn't answer right away. Then he turned and said, "Neither do I, but whatever it is, you'll meet it head on, just like you always have." She sat beside him. The window fogged with their breath. "Do you ever feel guilty for not seeing it sooner?" she asked. Charles stared ahead. "I feel guilty for being blind, for trusting blood over truth, for building my life in stone while everyone else was sinking in the mud." Clara reached into her satchel and pulled out her father's note, the one her mother had given her before leaving. She handed it to Charles. He read it slowly. When he finished, his hand trembled. "They broke him," he whispered. "Men like Richard and Jeremy. They stole his dignity 1 coin at a time." "And he still died honest," Clara said. Charles nodded. "So will we." The interview with Ellie Crane was scheduled for the following day. Private, controlled, no cameras. Just a tape recorder, a notebook, and a quiet room. They met in a public library in a neighboring town. Ellie was younger than Clara expected, early 30s, soft-spoken, clear-eyed. She didn't reach for a handshake when she saw Clara. She just smiled and said, "You've been very brave." The interview lasted 4 hours. Clara spoke first. She told the whole story. From the day she heard the moan beneath the soil, to the night she handed Charles a boiled egg and promised he wouldn't die alone. She recounted the ledger, the trail, the old whistle, the men in the woods, her mother's goodbye. She cried. Once, when she remembered what Charles had whispered that first night, "I saw your father's name." Charles spoke next. He didn't offer drama, just fact, dates, motives, documents. "I was foolish," he said, "but I'm not a fool now." Ellie didn't interrupt. She didn't rush. She only asked once at the end, "Why trust me with this?" And Clara said, "Because someone once trusted me with his life, and I carried it." The article ran 2 weeks later. It wasn't sensational. It was sacred. "The girl who dug up the truth." It quoted Clara's words, Charles's account. Ellie had verified every detail: court records, estate transfers, financial documents buried. In years of red tape, the story moved people, not to pity, but to anger, to reflection. Suddenly, Clara wasn't just a symbol, she was a warning that the smallest voice can echo louder than bloodlines, that greed has roots, but truth has feet, that silence buries but courage exhumes. People wrote letters, sent money, offered homes, but Clara didn't want any of it. She asked only that her mother receive care, that the Walker family name be restored, and that Charles be allowed to reclaim his estate, not for power, but for purpose. And he did. Stone Hollow reopened. Not as a private mansion, but as a recovery home and legal aid center for families exploited by corporate fraud and rural bankruptcy. Clara's father's name was etched into the side wing, the Samuel Walker Foundation for Rural Justice, and Clara? She returned to the woods, not to survive, but to remember, because the forest didn't just bury a man, it grew a girl who listened, and in listening, she heard the truth. Now the world was finally hearing it too. They returned to Stone Hollow at dusk, not with the clamor of police or the flashing of cameras, but in a quiet, deliberate procession of purpose. Charles walked without his cane that evening, slow but steady. Clara walked beside him, her boots now mended, her satchel lighter than it had been in weeks. There was no need to carry secrets anymore. The house rose ahead of them like a monument, to what had been, and what would never be again. Gone were the smug smiles of Richard and Jeremy. Gone were the veiled questions and the polite lies of Evelyn's cocktail parties. The grand doors, once symbols of exclusion, opened now to something simpler: redemption. The staff had changed. New faces filled the kitchens and corridors: volunteers, social workers, retired carpenters, and caretakers who believed in building, not hoarding. What had once been a mausoleum of wealth was being reshaped into a home of healing. Charles stepped into the foyer and breathed in slowly. "It smells like life again," he said. Clara smiled faintly. "Not like dust and greed." "No," he murmured. "Not anymore." In the days that followed, a strange stillness settled over Miller's Hollow. No more cars idled on back roads. No more strangers sat outside the post office watching through dark sunglasses. The town, once bent by secrets, now stood a little straighter, and the people began to talk, not in hushed tones, but in open conversations. At church potlucks, on porches, they talked about Clara Mae Walker, about what she did, about how the richest man in the county owed his second chance to the poorest girl in the woods. And still, Clara didn't speak much, not because she was afraid, but because her words, once given, had already done their work. She focused instead on her mother. Ruth had been moved into a small cottage near the estate, staffed with round-the-clock care. Her health stabilized. The pain remained, but her breath came easier now. She sat in the sun some days and read from her Bible. Other days, she hummed lullabies from her girlhood. When Clara visited, they didn't talk about what had happened. They talked about simpler things. "How's the garden coming?" Ruth would ask. "Tomatoes are late," Clara would reply, but the beans came up strong. One day, as Clara trimmed lavender from the edge of the old greenhouse, now repaired and repurposed, Charles approached her. I've been thinking, he said. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. That's dangerous, he chuckled. About the future. About yours. She straightened, cautious. What about it? I want you to have the northern field. Clara blinked. What for? Build on it. Plant. Raise goats. Run. Do whatever you want. It's yours. She shook her head. I don't want land. Then what do you want? She paused, then said, I want what my daddy never got, a fair chance to earn something that's mine. Charles nodded. Then I'll make you a deal. You manage the foundation with me. We pay you fair. You go to school when you're ready. I'll cover it. But the work, the effort, it's yours. Nothing gifted, everything earned. She looked at him a long time, then nodded. All right, but don't go easy on me. I wouldn't dare. And with that, a new rhythm took root in Stone Hollow. Each week brought visitors, families seeking advice, widows needing assistance filing claims, teenagers looking for someone to believe in them. Clara helped organize paperwork, met with lawyers, cleaned closets, cooked simple meals, and, when needed, sat with strangers who just needed someone to listen. She was good at that. She always had been. Charles wrote letters, hundreds of them, to victims of the companies his family had once propped up, to senators, to old rivals. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply acknowledged the truth and promised to do better with what time remained. One afternoon, a parcel arrived in Clara's name, no return address. Inside was a single ribbon-tied stack of folded papers, a transcript. A note was tucked between the pages. For the girl who wrote her story without ever holding a pen, E.C. It was Ellie Crane's article, set to be submitted for journalism awards. The final line struck Clara deep. Some heroes wear capes, others wear threadbare coats and carry soup to the dying, but they all choose, when it matters, to walk toward the dark, not away from it. Charles framed that line and placed it in the foyer beside the fireplace. Visitors always paused to read it. Then they'd turn, and Clara would be there, smiling softly, offering tea. Justice hadn't come with a gavel. It had come in spoons and long walks and choices made in silence. And for Charles, justice came with clarity. On the third Saturday of June, he called Clara to his study. You remember what I whispered? That night you found me? He asked. She nodded slowly. I never forgot. I think it's time you knew why I said it. He took a deep breath. I'd seen your father's name in one of Evelyn's documents, false wage reports, blacklisted, contractors. I remembered it because he'd once fixed my gate for free, told me gates are like people, open or closed, but they shouldn't be stuck. I never forgot that. Clara listened, silent. When I woke under the dirt and heard your voice, I thought maybe I'd died. But then I heard your last name, and I realized I'd been rescued by the daughter of the man they tried to erase. He looked at her. I whispered it because I wanted you to know this wasn't just mercy. It was full circle. You saved me with the kind of decency they tried to bury. Clara's eyes stung. She reached forward, took his hand. You weren't supposed to die, she said. And neither were you, he replied. That evening, they walked the orchard trail together. The sun was low. The trees buzzed with late spring hum. Charles moved slowly, but with purpose. When they reached the edge of the ridge, he looked out across the valley. Looks different now, he said. Clara nodded. It's starting to forgive us. And maybe it was, because some scars don't vanish. They simply soften with time. The orchard below would one day yield fruit again. The river would keep winding, the woods would keep whispering, and somewhere deep in those trees, there was still a patch of disturbed soil, now grown over with moss and wildflowers. A place that once marked death, but now carried the roots of something else entirely. A return, a reckoning, a resurrection. Summer passed gently that year, as if time itself had decided to tread carefully. Stone Hollow, once a tomb of old wealth, had become a place of movement. Not hustle, not chaos, but something quieter, purpose. The kind of daily rhythm born of mended fences, handwritten receipts, and bread that rose because someone cared enough to wait for it. Clara Mae Walker was no longer a name whispered only among kinfolk or written in brief under breaking headlines. She was part of something now, something she'd helped save, not with force, but with presence, with patience, with truth. And yet, she never let it change her too much. She still wore her father's old boots, still wandered the hills barefoot when the summer heat grew thick, still carried a slingshot in her bag and a pocket knife in her sock. Because for Clara, survival had never been a phase. It was a language, one she would always speak. The foundation grew in quiet measure, not as a charity, but as a promise. Its mission was simple: restore what was taken and protect what remained. They didn't just write checks, they rebuilt roofs, appealed wrongful evictions, took the time to explain what a contract meant before anyone signed. Families came from 3 counties over. Some didn't want help, just someone to listen. Others brought stories like Clara's, losses too small for courts to notice, but deep enough to leave holes in the soul. Clara met them all. She became known for her way of listening, not interrupting, not judging, just watching, eyes steady, as people placed their pain on the table like old tools, and then slowly found the courage to pick them back up again. One day, a boy no older than 10 stood in the doorway of the office with his mother. He held a broken compass and asked, "Can someone help me fix this?" No one laughed. Clara took the compass, turned it gently in her hands, and said, "We'll do our best." Later, Charles said softly, "That's how we begin, one direction at a time." He was aging now, more tired in the afternoons, less steady on his feet. But his mind remained sharp, and his voice held weight. He refused interviews, declined honorary plaques. But once, during a town hall, someone asked, "What turned it all around?" And Charles simply replied, "I was buried, and then a child brought me back." That line made its way into a mural downtown. Painted by local artists, it showed a girl kneeling in a forest clearing, her hands reaching into the earth, not to plant, but to lift. Beneath it, the words, "She didn't just find him. She remembered all of us." Clara didn't like the attention, but she didn't erase it either, because part of healing, she knew, was allowing people to hold on to the good, even if you never asked to be the reason for it. Autumn crept in on the fall, shoulders of cool fog and early sunsets. The air smelled of wood smoke and apples. Clara found herself drawn more and more to the woods again, not in fear, but in remembrance. She would walk the ridge trails, her steps soft, stopping now and then, to kneel beside a familiar log or run her fingers along a tree scarred with an old M. She never told anyone where that spot was. She didn't need to. The forest remembered for her. One morning in October, she returned to the cabin where Charles now spent most of his days. He was sitting on the porch, blanket across his legs, a notebook in hand. "I've been thinking," he said as she approached. She grinned. "Again?" He smiled. "I want to write it all down, every piece, not just for the court records, but for the ones who come after." Clara sat beside him. "What would you call it?" He thought for a moment. "Buried light." She was quiet, then nodded. "That sounds about right." They sat in stillness, broken only by the distant chirp of late crickets. Then Charles turned to her and asked, "Do you regret it? Helping you?" "No. Carrying the truth." Clara leaned back, eyes to the canopy. "I think about what might have happened if I'd walked away. If I'd heard your voice and left it behind like it was nothing." She looked at him. "And I realized that would have buried me too. Just slower." He nodded. "Then no," she said. "I don't regret it. It made me into someone who can't be lied to. Not by men, not by money, not even by silence." She paused. "It made me awake." That word hung in the air, awake, not angry, not broken, not bitter, but aware. Clara understood now that pain doesn't always knock you over. Sometimes it burrows in and waits, and the only way to stop it from turning you hollow is to speak, to act, to shine. Weeks later, she received a letter addressed in an unfamiliar hand. The return name read, Evelyn Whitmore, Federal Correctional Facility. Clara opened it on the porch steps. Inside was a single page. I don't expect forgiveness. But I wanted you to know that the night we buried him, I cried, not for him, for myself, because I knew then what you know now, money can't fill a grave. Thank you for undoing what we did. Clara folded the letter and slipped it into her satchel. She never replied. Some stories don't need sequels. They just need to be told, remembered, and then set down like old stones on a well-marked trail, because that was the point all along, not vengeance, not fame. Just clarity. Clara often thought about that first day. The sound beneath the soil, the broken voice, the man with his eyes swollen shut and his soul half gone. She thought about how easily she could have turned away, but she didn't, and in that single decision, she had rewritten not just one fate, but many. Now, others walked safer paths because of it. Children with shoes, mothers with shelter, men with second chances. Justice, Clara realized, didn't wear robes or carry gavels in these hills. Justice wore boots, walked barefoot in the rain, and sometimes Justice was 12 years old and didn't yet know how much. The world could bend beneath the weight of a single kind act. Before we close, tell me, have you ever carried the truth when no one else would? What did it cost you? And what did it give back? 10 years later. The trees hadn't changed. Their trunks were thicker, their roots spread wider, but they stood in the same solemn silence, as if time only brushed against them, never through. The ridge path curved the same way it had when she was 12, and the creek still hummed its low, gurgling tune through moss and stone. Clara stood at the edge of the orchard, now full-grown and tended with care. Rows of apple trees curved in even lines behind her, their limbs heavy with fruit. The air smelled of damp earth, windfall apples, and something else, something remembered more than named. It was a quiet morning, early October. The fog had lifted just enough to reveal the outline of the hunting cabin in the distance. She walked toward it with measured steps. She didn't rush. This wasn't a return to sorrow. This was a pilgrimage. 10 years had passed since she pulled Charles Whitmore from the ground. She'd been 12, small, stubborn, scared. Now she was 22, taller, surer, worn in places that time couldn't always heal. But there was strength in her now. A kind not born of hardship alone, but from choice. She opened the door to the cabin. It creaked, still, and still smelled of cedar and smoke. But it was empty now. Charles had passed that spring, quietly, in his sleep. No pain, no struggle, just breath, and then no breath. Like a story reaching its last word and accepting the period. Before he died, he'd written a letter, not a will, not a public statement, a private letter, left with Silas, sealed in a blue envelope, marked only with her name. Clara. Silas had handed it to her after the funeral. She'd waited months to open it. Today, in the quiet of this cabin, with the woods humming around her and the breeze threading gently through the half-open window, she opened it. The letter was short. My dear Clara, if you're reading this, it means I've gone. But I left the way I hoped I would, knowing you'd still be walking forward. There are no riches I could give you that you haven't already earned. No wisdom I could pass down that you didn't teach me first. You found me buried, but more than that, you found who I had once hoped to be, and gave him a second chance. I don't know where your life will go, but I trust it will be good, because you've always known the difference between what shines and what matters. There are 2 things I've left you. First, the cabin. Not because you need it, but because it needs you. Second, a name, not mine, yours. You changed what that name means in this valley. You turned Walker into something that can't be buried again. I'll see you in the trees. Always. Clara folded the letter with steady hands. She didn't cry. She didn't need to, because the tears she'd shed were already spent long ago on darker nights, in colder winds, when everything inside her had felt small and shaken. Now, standing in the light filtering through the old rafters, she felt only fullness. She stepped out onto the porch and looked across the orchard. Workers were gathering crates. Ladders leaned against trunks. Children, 2, maybe 3 years old, chased butterflies near the fence line while their mothers laughed nearby. Somewhere in the distance, someone rang a cowbell to signal lunchtime. The foundation had grown. It now spanned 3 counties. But Clara kept it rooted in people. No offices bigger than classrooms. No lawyers who didn't know how to listen. No buildings taller than the trees around them. It wasn't built to last forever. It was built to serve while it could, and that was enough. She walked down the trail one more time, past the old mark on the tree, the scratched M that had started it all. The moss had grown over it now, but she could still feel the indent when she ran her hand across the bark. She knelt there just for a moment, not to pray, not to mourn, but to remember. And then she stood and kept walking, back toward the fields, back toward the people who still came each week to ask the question no court could answer. What happens when the world forgets you? And Clara, every time, would say the same thing. I didn't. Because she hadn't. Not the man buried beneath the soil, not the father who fixed broken gates, not the mother who hummed songs even in pain, not the child she used to be. She remembered them all, and in doing so, she made sure no one else would be forgotten again.